Good afternoon, everyone. It's Friday afternoon, second to last talk of ZeveCon. I hope you all have some energy left to sit through these last two talks. I'll try not to ramble on too long. We've had a lot of excellent talks today, mostly quite technical. So for this talk, I would like to kind of take a step back and go a bit higher level and talk about the necessity really of a offensive development capability for red teams. Before I go into that, I would like to introduce myself and also kind of explain why you have to listen to me ramble on this topic for 45 minutes. So my name is Cas van Cooten. I'm a red teamer at a large financial institution in the Netherlands. That also explains my accent, so sorry about that. The Dutch-English accent is really horrible. I actually started out as a security consultant, so I studied information science, which is not at all very technical, it's more business-oriented. So I started also as a cybersecurity consultant, talking about privileged access management implementations and security policies rather than actually doing the hands-on work. But a couple of years into my career, I realized that hacking was way more fun. So I kind of did a lot of courses, did the OCP, OSCP, a couple of others, and rolled into the dark side of security, being red teaming. So nowadays I am the bad guy, and I focus on researching and thinking like the bad guys and bringing these attacks into practice. And when I started doing that, I also got an interest in the field of malware and specifically malware development. But because I am not that technical still, I really avoided learning C. So I picked up the Nim programming language, which is like a higher level version of C and C++. We will talk about it a couple of times during this talk. I will also have a DEF CON talk on this topic at Adversary Village. So if you're there, come find me. And I built a couple of tools that I published in Nim as well. So we will discuss two of them today, NimPackt and NimPlant. But I also released a couple of other random tools like Cloud Labs AD, which is an online lab environment like the ones that Tim just mentioned, and also a bug bounty scanner, which I wrote back in the day. If you want to follow me, you can find me on various social media. I mostly focus on posting on Twitter, not too good at managing the other feeds. And I like to post about half memes there and half technical content. So let's also take a minute to discuss what I am not. I already mentioned that I'm not too technical. I am also not a developer. Which may sound weird because I'm giving a talk 45 minutes about offensive development, right? But I'm actually convinced that to get into this field, you do not need to be a developer, right? Or you do not need to be a software engineer. So I'm mostly self-taught. So if any of you are actual developers and you look through my code, probably you will have several cringe moments because I know nothing about actually properly structuring your code. I know very little about design patterns, stuff like this, but I make my code work, right? And if it works, it hopefully ain't too stupid. So I would also like to give this to you if you want to get into the field of malware development. Don't be stopped by the fact that you may not know a lot about development before you start. So before we get into what offensive development is, let's talk a little bit about what red teaming is and why the red teamers love tools so much. Because we all know the red teamers love tools, they use them all the time. Why is that? That stems actually from a couple of challenges that we have as red teamers. Of course, as red teamers, we are very proud of our field of work. We like to brag about the cool hacks that we do and how lead we are. But red teaming has a couple of challenges. So first of all, red teaming is quite hard. There is a lot to learn, especially when you're starting out as a red teamer. But even for experienced red teamers, there's a high pace of information that you need to keep up with in order to stay advanced or stay ahead of the blue teams. You need to know a lot of technical information, and you need to know kind of the balance between the commands you're running and the risk of detection, for example. So just as a kind of thought experiment. By show of hand, how many of you are in offensive security? Or like red teaming? It's about half. Out of those people that just raised their hand, how many of you understand Kerberos? You guys are lying. No one understands Kerberos, and I am convinced of it, which is kind of a nice case in point, right? Of course, I'm joking there, but Kerberos is one of the things, like the protocols, that's very complex. And especially if you're just starting out in red teaming and someone starts talking to you about TGTs, service tickets, delegation, all this type of stuff, that's a lot of information coming at you. And you need to keep up with this stuff. So that's kind of the first challenge of red teaming. Another challenge is that during red team ops, there is a lot of risk. And I mean risk in two senses of the word. So in the first sense, as red teamers, we are almost exclusively testing in production. So we are touching client systems or touching systems within our internal company that are probably business critical, right? And they are production systems. So you all know the phrase, don't test in production. We are doing the exact opposite. So every action we take has a availability risk. So if we mess up, if we accidentally run the shutdown command or do something that crashes an essential process on the system, we are actually affecting production services, which can be very bad news, right? Especially for companies that are operations focused. The other sense of the word risky is the OPSEC risk, the operational security risk. So we are trying to stay undetected as red teamers, and every action that we run kind of has an implication for the operational security. In other words, for every action or a command that we run, we have a varying level of risk to be detected. And as a red teamer, you need to kind of know at every step you're taking for both these types of risks what the implications are. That's also hard to pick up if you're just starting out. Further, we don't like to admit it, but parts of our job really are repetitive. For example, if we are scanning the external perimeter of a company, there are tens of thousands of web-facing machines, and we want to know what is running on all these machines. We are, of course, not going to do that by hand, right? So we are trying to automate this type of repetitive task. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because basically tools can help at every step of this process. So the hard part of the job, we can learn from tools, right? If you're starting out and you're trying to understand, for example, Kerberos, what you can do is you can go to GitHub and analyze some of the tools that are there that exploit attacks against Kerberos or interact with it in some other way. You kind of make a collection of these two tools that you find interesting, and you can analyze them and learn from it. Tools can also help with the risky part of our job. Most notably, one of the big advantages of using tools is that we can verify what they are doing. So if we run either an availability risk or an operational security risk, we can kind of make that into a tool. We can verify with other red teamers maybe, what do you think the risk of running this tool is, and we can then run it. If something goes wrong, we can also analyze the tool and kind of see at what step the mistake has been made. So it's also traceable. And of course, the repetitive task I already mentioned, we can automate. So if there's 10,000 machines we need to scan, we can just run a scanner, and we can also run tools to automatically analyze the output. So in short, red teamers love tools because it makes our job a lot easier, and it also makes a good red teamer to know your tools, know to find the right tools, and know how to use them. Then the next question kind of becomes, where do we get these tools? You all know this struggle, especially if you're in offensive security. If you go to GitHub, you download, let's say, Rubius to do something on your target system, and you load it on the target system, you will get this nice Defender pop-up that says, malware has been prevented. It is no longer an option for us attackers to just use tools that are off the shelf, especially if they're malicious. Sometimes you can get away with them if they have some kind of legitimate use case, right? We just talked about LOLBus, for example. There are some edge cases where tools off the shelf, they do work, but that's a matter of tradecraft. But In general, the blue team is advancing so quickly, luckily, because that's also part of our job. It's advancing so quickly that all these tools that we know and love don't cut it anymore. So basically just grabbing these tools, copy-pasting them on our target environment is no longer an option. Then what is the option that we have to get these tools? There are a couple. So first of all, we can take the effort to actually build the tool from scratch, right? We can develop it ourselves. That already implies quite a big investment in terms of time, and we all know time is money, so for probably your employer, that's a big money investment. But it comes at the advantage of having full control over techniques and the procedures that you can apply on a target system. So there's a trade-off between effort and reward there. If you do not want to make that investment, what we can do is we can take the open source tools, maybe some closed source tools that you have access to, and we can modify them instead. So you take an existing code base and you modify it to fill your needs. Likely that's going to be evading defenses, right? Because we just mentioned that if you deploy a known tool on a target, it will get detected. So we can tweak it so that it's not detected anymore. Bit less of a time investment there, so the investment also in terms of money is lower, but you also hand in some of the advantages that actual development gives you. Finally, we can decide that we either are not in the mood for development or we just don't have the capability, and we can just throw a bag of money at the problem to make it go away, i.e. buying tools from other parties. So there's a couple of colleagues in this corner here that basically provide the service. So for example, Outflank has the OST proposition where you can basically buy their offensive tools as a service. But a very common BYOT capability for red teams is of course the command and control solution. So also shout out to Nighthawk in the same corner there. You can buy these tools to not make the effort yourself, right? And the advantage of that is you are basically outsourcing the issue of continuously modifying this tool to stay on top of signatures and the latest evasions. There were a lot of talks on, for example, sleep time encryption or call stack spoofing. You don't have to get what is actually happening. You just need to know how to use the problem or how to use the tool in a proper way. So these are kind of the options that you have to use tools as a red teamer in a modern environment. I would like to zoom in a little bit on the actual topic of development, because this talk is titled Build Your Own Tools. So we're going to discuss a little bit on what the advantage of that is. So we're zooming in on the first block here. I already mentioned that development is the biggest investment of them all, but of course there are a couple of advantages there that you can reap the benefits of. So first of all, developing a tool gives you full control over whatever you are doing. That makes sense, right? You develop it so you can decide from the ground up which design decisions you take to fulfill your goals. Of course, in the context of red teaming and especially adversary emulation, this means that you can exactly decide which TTPs or which IOCs you apply. And this gives you also full flexibility to, for example, emulate known threat actors, if that is your goal, or to stay away from known bad behaviors to evade defenses, for example. So it gives you full control. Secondly, and I already mentioned that actually, it helps with defense evasion. So defenders are doing a great job. Shout out to all the blue teamers in this room. Of course, our job as a red teamer is to help that. And the way we do that is to challenge them, right? It's to stay undetected in ways that also teach the defenders new techniques. So if you develop your own tools, because of this flexibility that you get, that means that you can stay away from all the known bad that is used by defenders to kind of identify that you're doing something malicious. So it helps with defense evasion. It's a great learning experience. I already mentioned I'm basically self-taught in programming. That's all because I kind of liked to build this malware myself. And at first I had no idea what I'm doing. I'm just looking at GitHub scripts, kind of throwing it all together to come up with something. And I noticed, hey, that works against defenses, right? But in the meantime, you're also discovering a programming language. In my case, I learned Nim by just starting to program in Nim. And you're learning about all these topics that we mentioned, for example, call stack spoofing or yeah, whatever technical topic you want to learn, right? If you implement it, you have a really intimate experience with understanding how it works and how to execute it in practice. So there's no better way to learn these techniques than to actually implement them in the tool. And finally, it's fun. Yeah, can be long or short about that one, but if you like programming, I know a lot of red teamers whose hobby it actually is to program stuff in their free time. If you like doing this stuff, that means that, yeah, it's also fun to write malware, right? And our job is basically a giant game of cat and mouse. The same goes for malware development. So it's fun to see your malware evade defenses, right? And it's fun to try to identify what allows defenders to detect you and then try to get around that. So it's overall a large investment, but it has many benefits and it's fun as well. So we're talking about offensive development, and another term that you hear often is malware development. In my eyes, these are not the same, so I have tried to make a bit of a definition on the difference between the two. Small disclaimer with this slide is that I basically pulled it out of somewhere. The sun doesn't shine. I made up this definition myself, so this is definitely an arguable definition, but I would still like to show it to kind of distinguish between the two. So I mentioned offensive development, which in my eyes kind of is the superset of all development that is used to support any offensive operations. So a good example might be network scanners, right? I wouldn't consider them malware per se, but they can be used to support red teaming engagements or even pen tests if you want to. So building a network scanner is not malware development, but it is offensive development. Now within that field of offensive development, we also have the field of malware development. I kind of gave it the arbitrary definition of any malicious tools or tools with malicious intent that are intended to be ran on a target system. Of course, there are a lot of varieties of this still, but yeah, it kind of narrows down the difference, right? So if you look at, for example, a C2 framework. We have the C2 server, which is running on your infrastructure, right? It's not touching the target per se. I wouldn't consider writing the C2 server actually malware development. However, we have the C2 implant as well. And the C2 implant, of course, is designed to run on the target system. Notably, it's designed to run covertly, so without detection. So I would then say that writing the actual implant of a C2 is malware development. The reason I'm making this distinction is that if we look at malware development specifically, we kind of have a whole different implication of the way that we need to think about our code, right? So we are trying to be evasive. So everything that we do in malware development is centered around this kind of OPSEC cost that I also mentioned before. So we are trying probably to minimize the amount of code, right? Minimize our footprint on the target. In an operational sense, we are trying to stay off disk and in memory. And all these kind of implications are very important for malware development. With this definition, of course, there are some kind of edge cases / exceptions. For example, if you look at Mimikatz, I would consider the memory dumping part, which runs on the target to dump LSAS, for example. I would consider the malware part, but if you take it offline and analyze it on your Kali machine, for example, then you're looking at offensive development. There's a couple of other examples here. Again, slightly arbitrary definition, so feel free to argue with me on that topic, but that's just to clarify the distinction. So zooming in on malware development a little bit, I often get the question when I tell people that I teach about malware, especially from people outside of the industry, I get the question, why? Why are you teaching people something that is, by definition, malicious? And that's a good question, right? Everyone kind of has an opinion on this. Some would argue that you're giving the bad guys the knowledge that they need to do bad things. I would kind of argue that, of course, to make this transparent is good for the entire industry. I hope you all being industry professionals, you kind of agree with me there. Again, we can have a debate about that over a beer later this afternoon. But yeah, I would argue that having this knowledge freely available, especially if it's already out there being abused by bad guys, is good for the industry, and that everyone in this room kind of picking up this field of interest and applying it for a good purpose, i.e. growing our defenses, right, maturing our defenses, that's a good thing for us as industry. So that's also why I'm very open about the fact that I write malware, right? I also open source most of the malware that I write, unless I use it in active operations, and I would encourage you all to do the same. So if you get into malware development, there's a very important decision to make, and that is what programming language to use. For people that already do development, this may be an easy question to answer, but underwater there's a lot of considerations that you need to take to decide which programming language that you use, because essentially, as a malware developer, you can use any language that you want, but they all have their benefits and they all have their drawbacks, right? So a couple of considerations when choosing a programming language are shown here. And one of the most important ones for malware developers is how high level is the programming language that you use. So for example, I know some seasoned malware developers in that corner, they prefer going as low as possible, meaning in this case using a language like C or C++ that is a pain in the ass to learn, but it gives you the most flexibility that you can get, because there's very little abstraction in the language, there's also very little guidance in the language, but it just gives you the raw tools that you need to interact with the operating system, for example. That's what C or C++ is. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the high-level languages. These are the languages that add layers of abstraction to make your life easier. So they're easier to understand, they're easier to read, they're easier to write. But these levels of abstraction also make it so that you have less control over what your program is actually doing. A good example of that would be Python, where almost the syntax of Python is similar to English language, right? Even if you don't know Python at all, there are chances that you can read a Python program, kind of understand the logic and see what it's doing. But in order to implement that, it's sacrificing a lot of the control that you have in lower level languages such as C or C++. Another important consideration is whether a language is interpreted or compiled. I think most of the people in this room would be familiar with the difference. In short, interpreted means that you run a binary like python.exe or you install a binary like python.exe on your system. And when you run a program, basically this interpreter will read your code line by line and kind of interpret it. So see what does this line mean and execute it. On the other end of the spectrum, we have compiled languages. This means that if you wrote your code and you're happy with it, you will run a compiler, which kind of at that moment looks at your code, looks at the entire snippet or like the entire source code and decides, okay, how can I translate this into machine code while optimizing it? So there's one moment where you press compile, and at that moment your source code will be translated into machine code. That has the advantage that once you generated your binary, so on Windows the famous example would be the .exe executable. Once you press compile and you get the binary, you can run it more or less everywhere. In malware development, we often look at compiled languages because of this portability, right? So if we want to run Python code on a client, that means we also have to ship the Python interpreter. If that's not expected in a client environment, that may not suit our goals, right? Because just dropping python.exe on an accountant's computer could be very suspicious. We can also, of course, make advantage of that. If we hit a developer machine which already has Python installed, suddenly that suspicion is gone, so we can make use of that. But that's, I would say, in malware development, more of the exception. So we look mainly at compiled languages. Then we have two more points. So we have a developer experience, which is kind of my catch-all to describe how happy you are or how sad you are while writing a language. So this includes that high or low level, as I just mentioned it, but it also includes how good the documentation of a language is, and very importantly, how big the community is. So for Python, again, a good example of a great developer experience where if you just type a very niche question into Google, you will probably get an answer to that very niche question in the form of someone on Stack Overflow that did it in 2011 and just pasted the code snippet that you can reuse. So this makes a very good developer experience. Excuse me. A very good developer experience, right? Where you can just look at this code and learn from it and implement it yourself. And the final point is prevalence, which kind of describes how often or how much is a language actually used. And especially the prevalence in malware development is interesting, because if a language is used a lot for malware, that means that defenders will also kind of move their spotlights to look at that language, right? So C and C++ is, I think, one of the most prominent languages for malware, which means that, that defenders are also kind of scrutinizing binaries generated in these languages to try and identify what makes this malicious. This point is also the point that kind of causes the interestingness of newer languages like Go, Nim, or Rust, because if a new language is released, basically no one gets it right, including defenders. So if a binary has a certain format that is not very well known yet, then you can make or kind of abuse that to slip through the cracks of defenders. And that's exactly what threat actors are doing currently. So if you look at the kind of trend lines of which languages are used for malware, of course I mentioned C, C++ is kind of the all-time high and still remaining that way. But you also see that threat actors are moving towards the younger and the newer languages, right? Because of these evasion benefits that it gives. So the landscape, I would say, looks a little bit like this currently. I'm sure I'm offending a couple of people that look at other languages for malware development right now, and this is by far not an exclusive list, of course, but I think that especially the kind of right part of this slide are the languages that we see the most for malware development now. And especially a shout out, of course, to the younger languages, Rust, Nim, and Go, which are being abused by these threat actors in an increasing fashion. Now we discussed the reason why people are switching to these newer and younger languages, right? Which is defense evasion. And I kind of want to summarize briefly what defense evasion is. We've had 2 days of talks on novel techniques which also help with evasion. But just kind of let's take a helicopter view and look at what exactly are we trying to achieve with evasion. Why are we even developing our own malware in the first place? In short, it's to avoid these areas of defenses, right? Especially in malware development, what we are dealing with prominently is antivirus and EDR. So antivirus, of course, you all have it installed on your own computer. Typically on Windows, it would be Windows Defender AV. It's often kind of ridiculed, even in the malware developer field, because it's fairly easy to bypass. Because antivirus kind of makes a habit of trying to fingerprint known bad. And also, very often, antivirus is static, right? So it's looking at artifacts on disk, for example. Maybe it's peeking into memory here and there to try to determine which processes show known bad indicators. But because it's fairly static, it's also easy to modify your code in a way that bypasses these kind of static indicators. The more challenging counterpart of AV is EDR. Of course, EDR is much broader than just the part that looks at malware on a host machine. But in a very basic sense, EDR looks at the dynamics of a program that is running. It looks into the memory, and even if it's not known bad, but it exhibits indicators that might indicate bad behavior, it either kills the process or it goes to the SOC and alerts. So as malware developers, we are trying to kind of slip through these cracks, right? To make our binary in a way that it at least gets past these two. Of course, there are a lot more defenses. Again, shout out to the blue team, the people actually sitting in the SOC to look at all the alerts that are coming in. Once these people actually get to see an alert which shouts out your malware, basically you are screwed, right? You are burning your first line of access, and hopefully you have another line there. So again, what we're trying to do is staying away from the blue team. How do we actually do that? There's a couple of decisions that we can take there. At a very high level, we have these decisions to make. So a very obvious first decision on evading defenses is avoiding defenses. Sounds like kicking in an open door, and it kind of is. But if we operate in an environment that has, for example, EDR installed on the endpoint, and we can avoid the endpoints altogether. So, for example, instead of running our malware or like our malware implant on a system with EDR installed, we can proxy into the network and run it over the network. Then we avoid the defense altogether, right? This is great, and this is probably one of the most efficient ways to bypass defenses. But unfortunately, it's not always possible because, of course, the blue team is trying to continuously increase their coverage on both a host level and a network level. So hopefully in your organization, the places where you can actually do this are fairly limited. We can also blend in. Blending in, I would define as either slipping through the cracks, so making your malware behave in a way that is believable enough to be let through by AV and EDR, or making clever use of the blind spots of defensive products. That kind of ties into the previous point as well, but another point could be that on the endpoint, even if there is AV installed but not EDR, that means that we can kind of dive into the memory level to go around the defenses that are installed, right? To blend in a way that even if some telemetry is gathered from our malware, it's not alerted on, at the very least, as malicious. Finally, we can also sabotage the defenses that are there. A common example of that in the case of EDR is, for example, to unhook the APIs that we use. So hooking is, of course, a defensive mechanism applied by EDRs. If we unhook it, we basically kick the EDR so that it gathers a little bit less telemetry, and hopefully then we can use that as a crack to slip through. Again, this can be effective depending on the defensive products that you're up against, but not always possible. So in general, defense evasion is a combination of these three, depending on the target environment that you're up against. So I mentioned I had two case studies of tools that I built. The first is NimPlant, which is a basic first stage command and control implant built in Nim. It has a accompanying C2 server built in Python because I'm, as I mentioned, not too technical, so I'm still most comfortable with Python. Some people would probably shame me for that. But I think it's an interesting case to discuss because it is kind of a prime example of what slipping through the cracks looks like. Because I'm very confident in saying that the reason that NimPlant bypasses defenses at all is that it's not public. It's a tool that I built, right? As I mentioned at the start, building this tool kind of gave me the full flexibility to implement, for example, the way it does C2 communications in the way that I wanted it to. And defenders haven't seen this. So even though this tool isn't that advanced, it still evades defenses because, well, the behavior is not known bad, right? It makes use of kind of this slipping through the cracks mechanism to bypass AV, even bypass EDR. And it works for that reason really well in operations, even in mature environments like the bank that I work at. So one of the lessons learned, if I look back at designing NimPlant, is that it is worth the effort to actually think about what you want to achieve ahead of time. So I started this project like really eagerly, and I basically just started rattling on my keyboard to build some of the cool functionality that I wanted to implement. If you actually want to use these tools, I would not recommend that because I had to go back a couple of times to actually shave off some of the bullshit that I had written in this code and optimize it and also make it more evasive because some of the things I did at the start were just really dumb design decisions. So if you want to pick up a project like this, take a day or something to think about the design, right? Think about the functionality that you want to implement and think about how you are going to make it evasive. Quick example of what that looks like. Here's the front end of NimPlant, which I'm quite proud of because I actually rewrote it myself. So that was a nice foray in the field of front end development. And here you can actually see a example of why I don't like the term fully undetected, because even though NimPlant, and in this case the self-deleting dropper that NimPlant includes, is not detected by AV or EDR, or in this case Defender for Endpoint, I should specify. We can see that if we look into the telemetry that's actually generated, it's still spotted, right? So in this case, the execution of an unsigned executable, of course, is suspicious, and you can see that the attributes of the PE themselves are also marked as suspicious. But combined, this was not enough for Defender for Endpoint to say, okay, I'm going to raise an alert. So again, you don't have to be fully undetected all the time, as long as you slip through the cracks and keep these indicators as low and slow as possible so that that alert is not generated and it does not reach the blue team. A kind of more interesting example in the sense of evasion is NimPackt. NimPackt is a packer that I wrote. Actually wrote it twice. Open sourced the previous version and at the same time started a full rewrite because again I just started coding and after a while realized that the initial code that it has wasn't cutting it anymore. But what NimPackt does is it takes code that is typically known bad. So let's say, for example, a Cobalt Strike beacon shellcode. If you drop that unencrypted on a target system, of course it will be flagged and it will be removed. So what NimPackt tries to do is to take this known bad, ingest it, and wrap it in a way that it can be executed on a target system. I should note there that NimPackt is only used in cases where you actually want to drop on disk of the target system. So it generates, for example, a DLL or something that you can use. So it's not always ideal, but it is very handy if you want to run something on the target system and you don't want to pack it manually every single time. Again, the lesson learned, as I mentioned, I started coding like a monkey on my keyboard, and it worked, kinda, for the first couple of months. But I would encourage you, if you want to pick something up like this, to first of all keep it simple. So use the KISS principle there, and also look at the modularity of your code, because especially in a tool like this, you may want to replace the functionality that it has every so often, right? You want to implement the latest and greatest loading methods and fancy functionality like call stack spoofing or sleep encryption. But if you write like a giant monolith of a script, that's going to be hard to implement, and it's going to keep getting worse. So for a project like this, think about modularity and how you're going to interchange the various parts of your code once you start building upon it. Again, this is what it looks like. NimPackt, of course, is a bit harder to slip through the cracks with, because if it is spotted, the behavior that it exhibits is very suspicious. So think, for example, process injection could be, if it is spotted by an EDR, very quickly marked as malicious with fairly high certainty. And you can see here that that's actually exactly what happened. But even in this scenario, which I wouldn't really use in production, because I did this as a demo to kind of show the difference between alerting and telemetry. Even if you look at these events that are generated by Defender for Endpoint EDR, if you look at it and you know it's malware, that's like, why did it not alert? And I'm actually still thinking that looking at this, but no alert was raised, right? And even for this process injection that it exhibited, it slipped through the cracks again. So a couple of final words for the people that actually want to get started in the malware development field. I think I already touched upon some of the points that are on the slides here, but just do it. Just get started. If you write ugly code, some people may ridicule you for it. If you use Nim or Python, some people may ridicule you for it. But it's better to have ugly code that works than not have any code at all, right? Or get detected using only public tools. As I mentioned, a lot of people are not shy at all about the fact that they write malware. So there's a great community. I'm very active on Twitter, for example, but you also have the Bloodhound Slack, or even communities for specific languages, and make use of that. So if you get stuck, just ask people that are in this space on what you could try to get out of that hole you are stuck in. And of course, there are a lot of excellent resources on GitHub and GitLab and stuff like this. One note on that is never blindly copy and paste, because first of all, as we mentioned at the start, public code is almost always fingerprinted if it's malware, so you will just get those fingerprints into your own code. And additionally, you won't learn from it, right? Instead of copy-pasting, try reading the code, understanding what it does, and then implementing that yourself. Couple of resources. Side note, I will publish these slides on my GitHub as well with clickable links, so you don't have to remember this. But one of the things I have to give a shout out to myself, because I just recently published a workshop, MalDev for Dummies, which kind of discusses the early steps into malware development, specifically focusing on writing your first shellcode loader. It was designed for C# and Nim, but actually this week someone submitted a pull request for Golang as well. So if you're interested in those languages, check that out. But the workshop is designed to be generic, so you can just use any programming language that you're familiar with. I also listed a couple of other resources with the respective languages. Shout out to Sector 7 for the excellent malware development courses. I listed essentials here, but there are a couple of chapters that kind of take you from zero to hero, really, in the malware development space. And other than that, there are a lot of resources, as I mentioned, on GitHub, depending on the language that you want to use. You could even go to Google and just randomly search for shellcode loader plus programming language name and find interesting examples. So summarizing this into defensive implications. Small side note, I am a red teamer, so probably this is kicking in a lot of open doors for you. But I think it's nicely summarized in the talk that Chris Peacock had yesterday in the Pyramid of Pain, right? So looking at hashes is near worthless, because as we saw, it's very easy to make malware that's different every time. So try to focus on the TTPs instead of the specific tools to detect this type of stuff. And very importantly, attackers also follow trends. So if someone goes on Twitter and says, hey, Sliver is the new cool, lots of people will try Sliver, right? And the same goes for malware development. If someone goes and says, hey, Nim is really cool for malware development, lots of people will try that. So try to stay on top of this in the form of threat intelligence or other feeds to understand what attackers are doing and focus your detections on that, because that may be the next big thing that is abused. Finally, some takeaways. I think it can all be summarized in one takeaway, really, which is if you think this is interesting, just get started. Malware development and offensive development in general is no longer an optional capability for red teams. Defenses are maturing, and so should your development capability. That doesn't mean that you have to do everything yourself. Of course, you can develop, modify, or just buy your offensive capability. But it's definitely no longer optional. So just look into this field, motivate your colleagues to start working on this stuff, and improve your next red team operation. That's it from my side. Thank you very much.